Welcome to Chapter and Verse, Part 2 with Ray's guest, Dr. Meredith Hastings. I'm reading your professional card. Brown University, Environmental, Planetary Sciences, Department of Earth. Welcome again, Meredith.
Thank you.
Dr. Lawrence Gould, Department of Physics, University of Hartford, College of Arts and Sciences. Welcome again, sir.
Thanks.
We have an extensive biography on both of our guests tonight, and I'm so thrilled to have both of them with us. We're so fortunate to have such wonderful people on our program.
Meredith was with us years and years back.
Oh, no, just last summer.
When was she with us?
Last summer.
Last summer.
Oh, just last summer? This past summer?
Yeah. You know, we're in the news again. We were in the news the last time, but there's been feature commentary and another feature editorial, I think, in the Providence Journal newspapers. And it has to do with the side from which you speak, Larry. Sheldon Whitehouse would like to criminalize your opinions. They want to prosecute you through the RICO Act, which is a mafia, and it was a mafia-inspired remedy to racketeering. When you hear something, this is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse is a major force behind the criminalization of speech. He's our senator. He might be watching the program.
When I hear that, I think of two things. One is there's something called the First Amendment, and freedom of speech is not only supposed to be a guiding principle in the United States, but particularly in academia. And the other thing I think of is a statement that was made about free speech at Yale University. I think it was from the 70s, which basically says that anyone who censors free speech does a double injustice. They prevent the person from saying what they have to say, and they prevent the other people from hearing what that person has to say, so that people then can no longer judge because you have basically turned the knob and closed off free speech. And when this has happened in the past, you know, it's been disastrous. For example, in the Soviet Union under Lysenko, Lysenko was opposed to genetics. He had his own scheme for, I think it was called vernalization. And the Soviet authorities then would remove people from the university who were opposed to that, or sometimes they sent them to Siberia or had them shot. And the same kind of thing happened in the Nazi Germany under, of course, under Hitler. These were more extreme situations, but there was Aryan versus non-Aryan science. And Einstein was a non-Aryan, and he finally left. And the thing that I really, one of the biggest things I hold against the regime at that time is that they destroyed a wonderful culture, a culture of Beethoven, of Mozart, of Einstein, art, science. People left, they fled because of what happened to their freedom of expression and freedom of speech. So maybe the senator doesn't understand all of these things, but it's worth bringing out.
Let me ask you a question. If he were here today, I know what he would say. Let me ask a question of both of you in response to what Sheldon Whitehouse would say. He's already talked about this in his opinion piece. He would say that the First Amendment is not an absolute amendment. There are exceptions for fraud, for libel, for slander, for child pornography, for yelling fire in a crowded theater, and there's another one I'm forgetting just now. But what he would say is that in the past, the tobacco industry withheld information from people, which caused a deleterious effect in the health of some individuals who believed that the tobacco industry was benign. That's what he would say. He would say that Exxon right now is trafficking in fossil fuels, and that that is a clear and present danger to inhabitants of planet Earth. What would you say to Sheldon Whitehouse, who might actually be watching this program, or someone who knows him might be watching this program right now?
You're asking me?
Yes.
Investigating a scientific issue is not a case of fraud. Okay, one needs to hear both sides in order to make a decision, and particularly making a policy decision. So, for example, if people don't know about what are the pros and cons, then they can't make informed decisions. An example of a policy decision which could have very serious effects is that in the United States, by 2050, we're supposed to reduce fossil fuels by 83%, okay? Now, the current level is about 5.4 megatons per person, or tons or megatons. It's a big difference on it, but it's 5.4, and I think it's tons per year, per person of CO2. And if you cut that down by 83% by the year 2050, that means you reduce people. If the population stayed the same, each person would be allotted 0.9 tons of CO2 emitted. Now, the population is not going to be staying the same. It will increase to about, projected, about 439 million people. So the allotment per person would be even less, to 0.7 tons per year, per person. And so then the question is, okay, so what? What does that mean? Well, Nigeria has that output, and they're not a high-tech civilization. So you have people, if I recall correctly, you have out of 100 people, so 3 people drive cars. Now, what would happen in the United States if you have this reduction? Okay. Roughly, it means that you'd be permitted to do a fifth of what you do in terms of driving, in terms of where you get your food, your clothing, and so on from. So if I had to drive 1/5 of the mileage, well, I don't have a problem because I'm only about 5 miles from school. But you have someone who can only drive 1/5 of the miles, and that doesn't cover all the driving that they have to do in order to get to their work. Well, what are they going to do? The big problem is people are putting in policy decisions without actually getting to hear both sides. And so you can have disastrous consequences. And then what do? Well, then it's too late, to do anything about it, or all the harm has been done. So that's one reason that you absolutely need freedom of expression and freedom of inquiry, particularly in academia and certainly throughout the rest of the country. That's what I would say to Senator Whitehouse.
What would you say to Senator Whitehouse?
Well, I have 2 things because I'd like to respond also. Energy is not allotted in our country in the way that you described. And so while we have to make this reduction overall, there are huge wastes of energy in the large systems, right? And so the way that our electricity is set up in this country is very inefficient. We've gotten rid of a lot of our dirty coal plants, and we can limit those more. And so I don't, policies that have been passed are not asking individuals to suddenly drive 1/5 less. But they're asking overall we need to reduce our CO2 emissions, against future potential global warming. And so I think it's not an individual allotment; it's a collective decision that we need to figure out how to reduce the waste in our system. In terms of what you brought up about Sheldon Whitehouse and this Exxon case, science, there's not two sides to any scientific question. There could be lots of different strains of evidence. There could be one single. So the fact that in the media we're always looking for two sides to every question, it's not necessarily the case in science that we would have to always listen to both sides. And so what are both sides? Are both sides Exxon and somebody who's not Exxon? Is both sides a scientist and a non-scientist? I mean, so I think in this case what happened with Exxon is that it was discovered that Exxon scientists years ago wrote memos to the higher ups in the corporate structure of Exxon and said, we have direct evidence that CO2 is going to cause global warming, and we're concerned about the consequences of that. And the higher ups at Exxon said, we're not going to talk about that. And they shut it down. And they didn't discuss it any longer, and they went along with what they were doing. And so they chose to not accept risk, right? They chose to say that we're not going to discuss that, and we're not going to accept that risk. And that's what had happened in the tobacco industry prior. So that's why the parallels are being brought up, is that in the tobacco industry, they had evidence that smoking was bad for you. They buried it, and then subsequently had to deal with the consequences of that.
Before I ask Larry if he had any thoughts about what your thoughts on Exxon are, what do you think about the RICO approach to the discussion?
I don't know that I agree with using that as a mechanism of punishment. I do agree with the idea that we need to uphold our industry to a certain standard. And if they are putting out fraudulent claims in order to sell us more product, then they shouldn't be allowed to do that.
Larry, what do you think?
I quite agree that fraud is bad. Whether Exxon does it or whether anyone else does it is wrong. Some of the other things that have been put out about Exxon is that they're giving money to promote something which is false. That would also be wrong if they were giving money to promote something which is false. But one also should talk about who's promoting what and for what reason. I was making a presentation to town councils months ago, and I was talking about global warming, and we were talking about the science. I mean, there are two sides. You're mentioning there sometimes there's just one side to the science. So I was promoting the other side. I think there were two sides to the global warming issue. And a person in town council said, of course, we don't know what your association is with the oil industry, implying that I'm compromising my integrity by taking money from the oil industry in order to present my position about global warming, and anthropogenic global warming. Okay. And he just said, well, time's up, okay. But he said that because I said, it's very strange. People always ask me this thing about Exxon, how much am I taking? No one asks me how much am I taking from the government. 2013, I did one investigation. There was about $2.5 billion that was financing research from the U.S. government, okay? And there's about 3 times more that went into things like so-called renewables, wind turbines, solar, okay? And everyone seems to want to, at least in the media, they're demonizing the oil companies. So I think that one has to look first at the science. Now, I think in global warming, there actually are two sides, okay? And that's the issue, too, that impacts on freedom of speech, because you need to hear both sides. And for the temperature that I was talking about before the break here, okay, the temperature globally is a very narrow band change, whereas locally it's quite a bit larger. And then you have to look at the output from the scientific literature as well. And there are predictions that are made. For example, the models have been touted as saying that there's going to be an increase of temperature over the years, okay? Now, the temperatures that we're talking about over here are not ranges of 10 degrees. The temperatures that we're talking about, for example, over the 20th century is about 0.7 of a degree Celsius, about a degree Fahrenheit, okay? So what are the observations and what do the models show? Well, the models all go up, okay? And the observations, satellite and also radiosonde, the balloons that measure temperature and atmospheric pressure, humidity, they're pretty flat over about the last 17 years. But some of the media are presenting that as the years are going by and the temperature variation is getting larger and larger, they're saying that now we're more and more certain that human beings are primarily responsible for global warming in the 20th century. Now, that's not in accord with the evidence. Also, people forget that from around 45 to 75, there were all sorts of articles about global cooling. People were worried about global cooling. So I think what needs to be done is more of an interaction between both sides of the issue concerning this global warming, in quotes, climate change situation. And it should be out there in the media, too, so that people can actually understand both sides, like what we're doing tonight. I think this is great.
Thank you.
Because it enables people to see different points of view on it.
Thank you both very much. I'm just looking through my papers to see if there's something I wanted to mention.
So the observations, satellite observations and the radiosondes both show increases in temperature over the last 20 years. A globally averaged temperature is increasing everywhere.
Okay, let me be precise.
Okay, okay, thank you.
In the tropical troposphere, that is between 20 degrees south latitude and 20 degrees north latitude, that is above the with respect to the equator, and the troposphere is the part of the atmosphere where the action is, so to speak. That's where we live, in the troposphere. It goes up around 11 kilometers or so. It varies when you go from the equator down to the poles. But there are predictions by the models, and that's certain values. And there are observations, and the observations disagree with the predictions. So that's what I mean. In terms of elsewhere on this is getting interesting because
I'll let you finish.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say it's interesting because we can now exchange our different positions on this, and and there are also other things besides the temperature measurements. There's the issue of the greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide. Now, if you read the media, carbon dioxide is a pollutant.
Yes, that's what
Carbon
the media
dioxide is the food of life. I mean, I remember a conversation I had with a local politician in the Hartford area. He was introducing someone after his little speech about how bad carbon dioxide is. And the person that he introduced went from wind turbines to natural gas, going after natural gas. And this local politician simply didn't understand that if you burn methane, you get carbon dioxide as one of the byproducts. And you also get water. And so I went up to him afterwards and I said, look, what would happen if we did get rid of all the carbon dioxide on Earth? Now we have about 400 parts per million by volume. At about 200 parts from what the plant people tell me, it starts to get dangerous for plants. I said, what if we got rid of all the carbon dioxide? And he didn't answer. Okay. So I said, well, you'd kill all the plants,
Yeah.
and you'd kill all the animals and all the people.
Because
And his
plants
reply
breathe.
was, so I see you don't believe in global warming.
Oh.
I said, well, what's the evidence for global warming? I don't see any evidence. He says, what about the melting of the glaciers? I said, that's melting of the glaciers. If it's a new thing that the glaciers have been melting, then you'd have to investigate what is the cause. That's the big deal. I saw a cartoon. I'd just be very brief, so I don't want to monopolize the conversation. The cartoon has a little kid in a crib saying, well, look, there are presents underneath the tree, and they tell me Santa Claus brought them, and there are presents underneath the crib, and the Easter Bunny brought them. So seeing is believing. It must be due to them. That's not the correct way of analyzing it. The correct way of analyzing it is there are presents. Now the question is, who brought them? So it's the same thing with with so-called global warming. The question is, okay, what's the evidence? And that's why I think you need this kind of conversation.
So I would argue there's very good evidence for global warming. I think that the media has changed the conversation away from global warming to climate change, and you talked about that earlier, about the use of that terminology. But there's very good evidence, and so carbon dioxide, we need carbon dioxide for the whole reason that our planet is habitable by people and plants is because we have greenhouse gases. So the fact that our atmosphere, if we had no greenhouse gases, it would be below freezing. It would be below freezing on the planet all of the time, right? So the fact that we have greenhouse gases actually makes our planet habitable. So the natural cycle of carbon on the planet is in balance. So trees, right, we breathe out carbon dioxide and the trees breathe in carbon dioxide, right?
Yeah.
In balance.
Yeah.
Burning of fossil fuels is adding, right, to that over and over and over. There's no drawdown of that fossil fuel, right? So some of that drawdown happens in the oceans and some of it happens by the trees. But we are adding and adding and adding and adding. So we have increased the greenhouse effect on the planet, which leads to atmospheric warming. So the ice sheets melting, the increase in the thermal expansion of the oceans because the oceans are warming. The oceans are warming from the top down because the atmosphere is warming the oceans. The loss of snowpack cover on the tops of mountains. The temperature rising both in urban areas and in rural areas across every continent. There are a number of fingerprints of atmospheric warming that are all good evidence of the hypothesis that carbon dioxide leads to an increased greenhouse effect, which leads to an increase in the temperature in the atmosphere, which then causes all of these effects. So I would argue there is very good evidence for atmospheric warming. There's also very good evidence that carbon dioxide is the primary cause. There's also good evidence that increases in water vapor are extremely important for increasing the temperature on our planet. So I do think there are two sides to the argument, but in my world, there are scientists who are working very hard every day to really understand and interpret the evidence and understand whether that evidence does fit with their hypotheses. And they're not taking for granted that an automatic expectation of what the outcome would be. And so I think our politicians have a very different way of speaking and a different way of interpreting the information that's out there. And so what would be great to see would be more scientists who have really understood the evidence and digested the evidence at the table discussing what there is good evidence for, what there is not good evidence for, and really presenting that to the policymakers in a way that they can use, and use in a very smart way. And I think what happens is that there's this, lost in translation, and this media hype and this media digestion, and then this presentation of every single evidence, argument being discussed in a way that is always two-sided. And I don't think not everything is two-sided. So not every kid wonders whether it's Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. Whether it's their parents, there's a third option, right? It's not always there's only two sides, right? So.
It would be great if the kid did wonder that. In terms of the good evidence, I think that's where there is a disagreement. There's water vapor in the atmosphere. And if you look at the IPCC reports, for the viewers, the IPCC is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's the UN body. that has reports coming out every 5 or so years, and they report on what they see is the problems primarily with greenhouse gases. But in one chart, for example, they completely leave out the water vapor, and the water vapor contributes overwhelmingly to the greenhouse effect. It's about, I forget the numbers, but it's like 90%. Carbon dioxide is a very small fraction of the atmosphere, of the gases in the atmosphere. Nitrogen occupies about 78%, oxygen about 21%. The 1% that's left is primarily argon and with trace gases of carbon dioxide. The way I'd like to present it is, if you think of a 1,000-person stadium and each person represents a molecule of gas in the atmosphere, the question is, how many people represent all the carbon dioxide? The answer is 40, approximately 40. That's all the carbon dioxide. That's from the biosphere that Meredith was talking about, as well as humans. How many people are contributing to the anthropogenic, the human part of the carbon dioxide? The answer is 1. So now the question one has to argue is, okay, so you've got 1 out of 100,000. What's the impact of that fraction of carbon dioxide, even though it's increasing? Carbon dioxide, here's another problem with the carbon dioxide. There's not a correlation between increasing carbon dioxide and increasing temperature. The temperature has decreased, as I mentioned, from around 45 to 75. That's when people were worried about global cooling. Carbon dioxide was increasing. If you go back millions of years, then the temperature doesn't correlate with carbon dioxide. Sometimes it's level. Sometimes carbon dioxide is level and temperature is going down. Sometimes level is going up, and sometimes they're going in reverse. So there isn't a good correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide. So you just can't go on correlation. Correlation, as they say, doesn't imply causation. So one needs to. There's so much to disentangle. Not only the temperature measurements, but also the problems in the temperature measurements. What's called the urban heat island effect. If you put your thermometers too close to the city, then they spuriously give a high reading. Okay, I'll shut up. Let Meredith come.
We've got 2 minutes to go.
Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that, so one thing that I find really compelling, so carbon dioxide alone is not the only control in our Earth system, right? We do know that, and there's reasons why CO2 would be going up and the temperature would actually be cooling, because CO2 is not the only control on temperature on the planet. So what I find really compelling is when you take an Earth system model, which we think has our best understanding thus far, and of how the Earth works and how the atmosphere and the ocean works and how they interact with one another. If you take a model that we think is our best understanding, and you take out human-made emissions of carbon dioxide, you cannot match the temperature over the last 100 years. So you have to include that in order to match. So that's not a so if you add in, water vapor, if you add in all of these things that we think we have a good understanding, I know water vapor on the planet is controlled by physics. Water vapor on the planet is not controlled by humans at all. And so we have a good understanding of how that should be working. And that is, and by itself cannot explain the temperature on the planet. And methane by itself cannot explain the temperature on the planet. So if you combine all of these things, you can match the observations of temperature on the planet. But if you don't include CO2, you can't match those observations. So we need CO2 to match the observations, but we also can quantify how much of an effect on temperature there is because of burning of fossil fuels. And we can't match the observations without that increase in temperature from the burning of fossil fuels.
I can't say enough about your appearance tonight. I don't mean to. Did you have something to add really quickly?
Well, what I agree is that there's more than one thing you have to look at. And one of the things is also called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. That happens every 27 years or so. And so it's extremely complicated system. And I think the best way of handling it is if we can get people on Meredith's side and people on my side together to actually have conferences to discuss these kinds of things. That would be a huge advantage to science and I think to the public at large and to policymakers.
Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Yes, we thank
We
you.
have to wrap it up.
God loves you, and so do we.
See you next time.